Hello, Brain Damaged Philosopher here. I think this is going to be a pretty short video because I've had a headache for about 5 days straight now, and that's really not conducive to deep and nuanced philosophical thinking, nor to coherent speech. So I apologize if I'm a bit more stuttery and confused than I usually am. But I did want to get this out of my system since I haven't done really anything productive in the last month or so, or at least 2 weeks, I think, since my last video came out. Um, in this video, I want to touch upon what I said I would cover in the next video in my previous video, which is a theory of justice. Specifically, I'm going to be drawing out this concept of justice from the virtue or faculty of rationality and particularly moral self-judgment that I mentioned in the previous video. Before I do that, though, I think I want to explain specifically how justice is different from morality. In my view, ethics and morality is supposed to guide individual action. Justice, on the other hand, is supposed to guide specifically an individual's action within the context of interacting with other individuals, and should also govern a set of punishments or rewards that can be enforced by others and should be accepted by the individual in cases where that interaction with others goes wrong. So essentially, it's a subset of ethics that talks about the point of contact between the individual's morality and the existence of other individuals, and also adds in the possibility of punishment or reward. Usually just punishment. Also, usually, in the case of punishment or reward, it's a two-part question. Both what the person who is to be punished or rewarded should accept, and what those around them who have their own moral obligations and desires and so on should actually be able to do or impose on the person who is to be punished or rewarded. So the whole core of my theory of justice comes from the idea that abstract reasoning is the core focus of the faculty of rationality that humans have. There are other things like, the ability and desire to learn and curiosity and so on, but abstract rationality is the core. And one of the important features of abstract rationality is the ability to, of course, abstract concepts out by differentiating what is incidental and what is essential to things, and by understanding that some things are a priori logically relevant and a priori logically irrelevant. This is how we're able to apply such fallacies as non sequitur and red herring to our reasoning, is because our abstract rationality allows us to recognize things that just aren't related to the core point. And so from this capacity for abstract rationality, if we apply it to the individual themselves, we get the concept of universalizability. Basically, the idea that there is something about me as a human being that makes me a moral actor. And when talking about moral matters, and specifically when comparing myself to others, generally that thing that makes me a moral actor or makes them a moral actor is what's relevant when we're speaking in moral terms, and not peripheral things such as skin color that have no a priori relation to moral reasoning, unless some specific justification is given, of which, for most of these, which we shouldn't assume is there until it's given, essentially. And so this idea of universalizability is actually brought out instinctively in our conception of fairness, in the sense that how others are treated should be how we are treated, in broad strokes, and also in our sense of what Freud called the superego, the sort of part of ourselves that watches our own actions like we believe that others, or the sort of abstract concept of the other, watches our actions and judges them. That second part might require a little explanation. So the reason that's related to universalizability is basically what we're doing is we're stepping out of the sort of natural obsession with our own particularity that comes with the experience of being an embodied ego, and sloughing off all the particular details about ourselves that we think make us special, and viewing ourselves like we view others. There's obviously a dark side to this conception of the superego, but the core of it, the thing that makes it tick, as far as I can tell, is this capacity for universalizability and differentiating what's important to the matter and what's not. Now, this raises a question. What particularly is it that makes us a moral actor? Well, that's going to be bound up, almost by definition, in the definition of what a moral actor is. And, at least in my comprehension, a moral actor is an actor which is capable of three things. One, having a chain of justificatory desires, as I described earlier in my series, which is what allows us to have ethics, by having an overriding desire that must be at the end of a chain of such justificatory desires in order to motivate all our actions, and therefore can govern and direct all our actions. Without such a desire, then having any particular single thing that guides our actions is impossible. And without being consciously aware of it and having, it form justifications instead of just being an instinctual desire, then we could not be aware of it for it to guide our actions in the conscious, rational sense that is required for moral action instead of simply motivation. And this brings up the second point that makes one a moral actor, and that is the capacity to hold and follow rational, or logically structured moral propositions. If you are incapable of representing or understanding a statement such as one should not steal or one should not kill, or incapable of following it or communicating it to others, in hypothetically at least, or no, scratch that last one. But if you're incapable of following it, understanding it, or holding it in your mind, then I don't think it makes sense to call you a moral actor, because you can't act according to morals. Because morals are propositions about what ought to be. And then the third thing is the ability to generate moral propositions of one's own. And so if you bind up all these together, you get something that makes sense as a moral actor, something that can understand and follow moral propositions, can generate them, and has a reason to possibly follow what we would call a morality at all in the first place. And since that is what is relevant when speaking of people in moral terms, then that is when speaking of ourselves in moral terms or others, we can shake off all of the extra details and look only at those three qualities. If they have them, they are also a moral actor. And differences in them are what determines the differences between moral actors. And what do I mean by differences in them? Well, some actors, animals, for instance, are not moral actors because they are incapable of any of those three to varying degrees. And some are uh, subordinate moral actors, for instance, children, and that they are not yet fully capable of those three. And likewise, an important difference that can be had in those three properties is the particular moral propositions that each actor is holding, obeying, or generating. And so this brings us to the next point, is that when one takes an action, as discussed in my epistemology videos, I believe, in one of them, one is making a moral proposition about that action, that it is permissible. And so if one wants to analyze that action in terms of morality, you have to scrape away all of the particular details and just look at the action and the person, the object, and the situation, maybe. If there are any particularly, a priori relevant moral details to the situation, which is basically impossible. So you're basically left with the action, because morality is all about action. And then the actors, because they're both, and whether they're both moral actors and in what way. And so, whenever we act, we're making a proposition that the action was moral. And so, if we look at the action and universalize it, we take away all of the extra details from the particular action except those three things. And then we also universalize the actors involved by taking away all of the extra details except just, those three properties. And then we can make judgments about the morality of the action and say that that more abstract, that stripped down to the bare bones proposition is the actual moral proposition that was affirmed in the action. And this is where things get interesting. Because if part of the idea with the rationality faculty and abstract reasoning and universalizability for humans is that we fundamentally understand this concept of fairness and the superego, where we really aren't different from others, except in these sort of universalizable ways that aren't morally different, then in the affirmation of a particular moral proposition, abstracted out in this way, which I'm going to call a maxim, a moral maxim. I'll use those two interchangeably, moral maxim or maxim. Then, if we affirm a maxim in our action, then we must also view that maxim, because we're speaking on a moral dimension, as permissible to all other actors that are that have no morally relevant difference from us. And so we must view that maxim as permissible not just for ourselves, but to all moral actors that are not relevantly different from ourselves, in those particular properties that make them moral actors. And this is sort of how you get sort of a soft deontology out of my ethics. I say soft because it is flexible to a certain degree, because this is not the end-all be-all. This is just an inner nested component of my greater ethical system that just describes a conception of justice. And basically the conception of justice is that if we wish to, fully embody the moral dimension of our rationality, then we should only act in ways that we would accept other moral actors, which are not morally relevantly different from us, acting. So that's sort of the personal component to justice, which I spoke about earlier. The understanding of what one should or should not do in relation to others or to others. And the two others is especially important for this reason. If we are universalizing between ourselves and the people we interact with, then part of the understanding that we should feel with others, which is sort of like empathy but more abstract, is that we should almost put ourselves in their shoes in order to fully understand the emotional or the real impact of the maxim. So in order to understand whether we truly would desire others to act on the maxim that we are acting on, we must put ourselves not only in our own position, but in the position of someone experiencing that action from the other side. Obviously, because if everyone did it, then we would be both doing it and experiencing it being done to us or in our vicinity. And the strongest, most base thing that people feel in relation to things being done around them or with them is a sense of self-preservation of person and also property and family. A sense of self-defense or self-preservation. That's the strongest and first, by far the strongest, by leaps and bounds the strongest and first barrier to that one must cross and find acceptable, to find a maxim from the receiving end acceptable in its implications. And so what I mean is that if you are considering how it feels to be on the receiving end of an action according to a certain maxim, the first test and the hardest test, but also the most rarely violated test, is whether it violates our sense of self-preservation and bodily autonomy and stuff like that. That's the thing we should be most aware of, because that's the thing that is most universal to everyone, most base, most strongly felt, most visceral. After that, everything else is far less important when considering if being on the receiving end of such a maxim is actually acceptable. And the result that this has is that this means that when considering the morality of an action, if no one else but you is involved, then you have to consider no one else but yourself when considering whether you're okay with everyone following this maxim, because you'll never be on the receiving end of it, because it's impossible for anyone to be on the receiving end of it. If other people are involved, then it becomes much more interesting, much more important, but also much more difficult to assess whether such a maxim is actionable, such a moral maxim of your action is actually acceptable to you. And furthermore, when a violation of self-preservation or bodily autonomy is involved, then it becomes even more of an important and also difficult bar to clear to determine that such a moral maxim is actually morally acceptable to you if you are on the receiving end. And this is how we get to the personal part of justice. The part of justice that deals with how you personally should find your interactions with people morally acceptable or not acceptable. Furthermore, there's another side to this. For if you do an action without thinking about its moral implications, or with thinking about them and do it anyway, and it affects other people, then you've already affirmed it. So now you need, in order to be consistent, to accept the effects that the inaction of that maxim on you has. So, for instance, if I run red lights, then I need to accept, I can't be upset without being inconsistent. Um, I, I can't be upset about any effect that other people have running red lights has on me without being inconsistent. If I just ran a red light and nearly crashed into someone, and then later on, like, and I'm talking to everybody about how much, I think it's silly that we can't just run red lights, and, I'm, whatever. And then later, someone runs a red light and crashes into me. If I go complaining around to everyone about, being crashed and into, I'm going to look like a hypocrite. And I will be a hypocrite because I'm complaining about, the very thing that I think is, I'm complaining about experiencing the effects of something when I was perfectly happy to force those effects on others. And then this is the second component of, the personal aspect of justice. What penalties one should accept when one does an immoral action in interactions with others. And in this case, one should accept proportionate and natural sort of boomerang results from one's actions, one's moral maxims that they hold, um, because, they hold them, right? And so if I hold a moral maxim, I must, to uphold my rationality, accept the whatever comes my way out of other people enacting the maxim that I'm affirming. And importantly, I think there's like a sort of a cool-off time to this as well, in the sense that I can't just flip between holding a maxim and not holding a maxim in order to avoid consequences. Because that's, again, self-serving and inconsistent, because you're not flipping you're not flipping the maxim for any good reason, just an arbitrary self-serving reason. Not like an a priori justifiable universalizable reason. So if I hold the maxim that running red lights is okay while I do it, but as soon as someone crashes into me, I announce, or actually, this is a better way, a better example. If I hold the maxim that stealing is acceptable while I steal things, but when someone comes to take them, back from me, I'm suddenly and very conveniently holding the moral maxim that no, you can't take things away from me because I hold the maxim that taking things away from people is bad. And then as soon as they give up, I go back to holding the maxim that taking things away from people is perfectly fine. Then that's obviously inconsistent and hypocritical, once again. And so now let's get on to the interpersonal component of justice. So there's the very base, obvious component of it, which is that on a sort of basic level, no one can be blamed morally or really encouraged morally to completely divorce themselves from defending their own eudaimonia. So no matter what anyone else is doing, no matter what the moral situation is, defending one's own eudaimonia is always morally acceptable. And it doesn't matter whether someone who's trying to take my eudaimonia away from me can be called, morally wrong or not. That doesn't even matter at all to whether I can morally defend myself from them. But on the other hand, oh, it does matter if you're going to enforce morality on other people. whether one can actually say that they are morally in the wrong, or that what you are doing is morally acceptable in relation to their immorality. And so, that's why the interpersonal part of justice is important, because it's not just, we can't, people don't just have the right nor the duty to merely defend themselves. They're also involved with defending others, and then you need a way to determine when defending others is okay, since it is not always and unconditionally okay from my definition of egoistic morality, like defending oneself is. And so basically, the test for whether enforcing some penalty on someone else is actually in alignment with one's, universalized abstract rationality or not, is essentially estoppel. Basically, the idea that if someone professes to believe something, they can't take it back if they relied on it, and it can be enforced on them. So basically, if someone demonstrates in their action that they hold a moral maxim, and then you act on that maxim in a way that and their moral maxim had a bad effect, a harming effect on others, and so your inaction of that moral maxim on them has the effect of harming them, and is therefore essentially a penalty, then this is acceptable because they've already rationally demonstrated that they believe that such a thing is acceptable in demonstrating that maxim, and so they've essentially given their consent, and they can't rationally object to that penalty because they've previously declared that it was declared in action that it was acceptable. And so they could have changed their mind, but the only way to demonstrate that they've changed their mind to the same strict amount that they demonstrated that they believed it in the first place, they would have to take action, essentially in either accepting punishment, punishing themselves, or providing restitution. They can't just say it, because they're not saying it doesn't demonstrate it as strongly as acting on it. Importantly as well, the person that enacts that maxim on so person A enacts a harmful maxim, and person B enacts that maxim on person A. In this case, person C or D or even A can't immediately enact that maxim on person B for a very important reason. Remember, the criteria for moral actors and differentiating them includes what moral maxims or propositions they hold. And so there is actually a relevant difference between actor A and actor B. Because when actor A enacted the moral maxim, presumably, there was no difference, no relevant difference on the level of universalization and moral actors between person A and the person, let's say person E, that they acted on. But now that A holds such a maxim, then person B enacting that maxim on person A is actually saying that enacting that maxim is only acceptable, is only necessarily saying, anyway, that enacting that maxim is appropriate on people who already hold the maxim. And so B is actually holding a new maxim that is like enclosing the old maxim, and that new maxim actually specifies a relevant difference between the subject that's doing the action and the object that's receiving the action. And so you can't move actor B from being the subject to being the object of the maxim that actor B is holding. the new wrapped maxim. And so an example of this is that if A murders E, A's and E is just a random innocent person on the street, then A is holding a maxim that murdering any moral actor is acceptable. Whereas if B enacts, if B murders A, then B is holding a maxim that murdering people who believe murdering anyone is acceptable. And B obviously doesn't believe that murdering anyone is acceptable. They believe that murdering people who believe murdering anyone is acceptable. And, yeah. So B's own maxim doesn't apply to him. Or them. Yeah, so that's the basic idea for this system of justice. My headache is getting a little worse. I'm getting a little confused, so I'm not sure if there's anything else I want to say. If there is, I'll probably talk about it in a future video. But the general gist is that for personal morality, ask yourself if it would be okay to be on the receiving end of an action following the same maxim as your action, or living in a world where people act like that. And for enacting justice on others, it must be proportional and something they sort of essentially already quote unquote consented to. Yeah, so this has the interesting component of obviously making any almost being a bit of like a negative utilitarian thing, but I'll talk about that in my politics later.